Hello everybody, you're very welcome back to Law Hero. My name is Jen and I make videos about the law, but more recently I've been branching out into more so economics and psychology. And today is a wonderful video because it's inspired by a book I read over Christmas, which my mother is currently reading, so I don't have it here in front of me. But it was called The Laws of Persuasion, the Psychology of Persuasion and Influence, and apparently it's like the number one marketing book out there. And I'm obviously very interested in how businesses work, so I've started to branch a little bit more into this area. And today I'm just going to summarize the things I learned from the book, some of which weren't new to me, but some which were. So that's what I'm going to go through today. So the first thing we need to realize is that there are certain weapons of influence that are used quite consciously in order to encourage people to do certain things. And what marketeers do and what advertisers do is they play on something which is called a fixed action pattern. A good example is when a girl walks by with a big, derriere or nice derriere. Or, for example, when I walk past a shop and I see something sparkly, I'm like, oh. So they play on these automatic reactions or fixed action pattern. And there's a really good example given in the book whereby mother turkeys, when they hear the baby go cheep, 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 they immediately, there's an immediate nurturing reaction, and it's not because of how the baby turkey looks, it's because of what it said or what it cheeped. And in order to prove that it was that alone, they brought in I had to get this right. They brought in a robot to impersonate the baby turkeys. And even though it looked different and felt different, when it gave the exact same cheep, cheep noise, the mother turkey started to nurture it because of that automatic response. The same is with the robin redbreast. This will trigger an automatic response in its predators. And it's the simple colouring of the robin's feathers alone which causes the response. In recent parlance, this is called a trigger, and actually it's been proven scientifically that trigger warnings don't work for this reason alone. It's an involuntary response. So I ask you to ask yourself, do you have any involuntary triggers or automatic responses that people may take advantage of, which is mean obviously, but I'm just asking you to be a little bit more aware. In this vein, we realize that there are certain shortcuts to getting reactions, and the best example of a judgmental shortcut is a stereotype. You hear blonde girl, lawyer, so you have immediately stereotyped what kind of person I am, even though you have no basis around my character or personality. Your brain has already taken the shortcut and making assumptions. But at the same time, we have to realize that brain shortcuts are important, because otherwise we would obsess over things to no end. Human beings like certainty, and that's why shortcuts are important. So for example, when I hear managing director, I have already presupposed in my mind certain characteristics that a managing director will have, and that creates a sort of soothing effect because of the certainty of what I'm supposed to deal with. Civilization advances by increasing the number of operations we can perform without thinking about them. And that is the premise behind, for example, as I call it, the Ryanair effect. You reduce the amount of resistance to get people to the checkout, because the more prompts there are, the more the human brain will just give up and go, I'm not dealing with this, I'm not booking the flights now, I can't be dealing with this, like happened to me the other day. Whereas if the resistance towards like doing something, for example, buying something, or like me recording this YouTube video, the camera's just here and I can just record, the resistance is very low. That progresses human civilization because the shortcut is already made for me. So to summarize, marketeers and others, advertisers for example, they prey on our impulse to create shortcuts. That is the first lesson we're going to learn today. Now, the second law of persuasion is the law of reciprocity. And you will have heard me speak about this law before. Basically, this law is unique to humans, which is something that blew my mind. So, for example, I do something nice for my dog. He doesn't feel any obligation to repay me in kind because he doesn't have that social inclusion need that I have as a human, which is bound together with the law of reciprocity. You may have heard the phrase, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And this is exactly what the law of reciprocity means. When there's a freebie, it's not really a freebie. There is some self-interest involved. A good example would be free samples at the supermarket, or if you buy something online and they send you out free samples. And I suppose the question is, how do we arm ourselves against the law of reciprocity? And there's some very famous examples like Jehovah's Witnesses, or like some people at the fairground in America, they would press a flower into your hand and walk away, and you'd be just like, I don't know what to do with this flower. And then they'll come back and they'll be like, could you please give us a donation? And what they've done is they've given you something meaningless, but they've created that trigger response of reciprocity, and you feel like you have to give. It's kind of like an honor system that's put on you. And the remedy to resisting this reciprocity law that is very natural is to simply not accept gifts. So if people are trying to give you gifts and you think to yourself, oh, this is going to build up a relationship, this is going to put some kind of onus on me to respond, the best thing to do is not respond to the freebie. The author gives an example of women who go on first dates and let the man pay for them. Unfortunately, in the mind of a man, if you let the man pay for everything on the first date, and this has been asked of the man in this survey, they all said that they would presume that the woman was more sexually available because of her willingness to be paid for. And even though in the woman's mind she's like, oh, it's the man's role to be a provider, I ought to be treated on this night out, it's a quid pro quo. You get nothing for nothing in this world. A random stranger isn't just going to buy you a meal and just walk away and expect nothing in return. There's always supposition that if you accept something in kind, you have to make a response. And if you go through life thinking otherwise, as this book shows, you are an idiot. Okay, so the next area is commitment and consistency. So Da Vinci said it's easier to resist at the beginning than at the end. And it has been shown that commitment and consistency to a goal is actually what achieves that goal. And if you are, we'll say for example, in a toxic relationship and you kind of knew you should have got out at the start, when you're knee deep in it, it is very deep. Like it's going to be very difficult for you to get out of that. Because you've already committed and you've been consistent in your actions, and then there comes cognitive dissonance because you're like, yeah, but I've been in this for so long, I need to keep going because the brain likes certainty. And then of course you have the sunken cost bias because you've been there for so long, you might as well keep going and not throw away what you've invested in. So be wary of these biases. And a very good example is after placing a bet, people are much more confident of the horse's chance of winning and they are immediately before laying down the bet. This is because of our obsessive desire to be consistent with what we have already done And this is also the principle of cognitive dissonance. So as I just said, because you've committed to the bet, you're like, oh, okay, I'm feeling better about this because there's been some kind of certainty. And if you watch my video last week about social media, you will see that it's this need for certainty in our lives that causes all this chaos. Like I remember when I was reading The Inside Out Revolution, the guy was simply like anything that comes into your life is gifted to you from the world. Like you come into this world as a helpless baby with no possessions, and as you because human beings strive for certainty and safety, not to be kicked out of the tribe, not to be isolated, we try and surround ourselves with material possessions, like obviously material possessions and people and status, like almost like a fort around us in this citadel. And then our life's passion and ambition is to hold on to everything as much as we can, keep in the grips of control. And once any one of those things starts to slip, that's what causes anxiety. You know, that's what, like, you see people who get into debt, their mental health spirals because they cannot separate the debt from the person. And that's why you have, you know, these high-flying CEOs, all of a second they're just like, no, I can't do this anymore. And then they go to like a monastery where all they have is like dry bread and water, and the way of life is much more simple because they've let go of everything, and then they become a human being and not a human doing. And when I say human doing, I mean trying to protect everything we've built up. The most serene way you can be, and I'm trying to practice this myself, is just see things as they are. Material objects are material objects. They come, they go, they're not mine. They're not mine. They are in my possession, but they don't belong to me ultimately. Same with people, same with opportunities. And once you adopt that mindset, you mitigate this commitment and consistency thing, and you become much more fluid and comfortable with the disruptions, because you're like, disruptions are going to come because I'm just passing through. And consistency is a big problem, is because consistency is really valued in this culture. You'll see, for example, Donald Trump, extremely consistent but not right, okay? But people valued his consistency. They were like, he hasn't changed. He walks it like he talks it, and people really valued that to the detriment of him being right. So that would be an example. And when this is true, and when people value consistency and commitment, it can be used nefariously against you. So, for example, the author gives a very good case study of during World War II, when there was American prisoners of war in the Chinese prisoner camps. And the Chinese, being masters of psychological warfare and especially torture, they would be extremely consistent with the American soldiers that were staying in the camp. So they would start with some minor requests of the soldiers, so small little things like, like give us some of your cigarettes, tell us some things about the US Army, like really small little things. And they would build it up and up as the relationship progressed, like real toxic relationship. And it was found that when these soldiers realized they were collaborating with the Chinese, they began to call themselves collaborators because of the principle of cognitive dissonance. They needed their outside world to be consistent with their inside world, and it was much easier. It was a shortcut to give in to that reality rather than resist what was going on, which would be inconsistent with their reality. I find this fascinating because it's the whole principle of slowly catch a monkey. You won't necessarily get people to comply going in all guns blazing. It's better if you drip feed them and get them to come on board eventually. And now that I've said that, you can think of lots of times in your life where you've been drip fed and have eventually become indoctrinated. It's what Hitler did to indoctrinate the German people. It started off as something very innocent, it was community led, we want people to get back to the old ways. So it was very it was very sort of altruistic type of movement, one for girls, one for boys, get back to the traditional ways that have been eradicated because of Industrial Revolution. But then it slowly turned into hate. It was always hate from the beginning, but you can't blast people with the hate. You have to get them up to a certain level of trust. So that is why you have to be very, very careful in complying with seemingly trivial types of requests. That goes for accepting gifts at work, accepting gifts from people who you need to maintain a professional relationship with. Another tactic the Chinese would adopt is to get the soldiers to actually write essays, because they believed there was something magical and compelling if it was written down, and this also fed into the principle of consistency. And the most powerful motivator is to get the subject to own the idea. And that was another reason why the Chinese would get the US presidents to write essays about, the pros and cons of the American military, because, if they just got them to write on the cons, the soldiers would sniff a rat and be like, oh, this is, anti-American feeling, pro-communist feeling. But instead what they got them to do was the pros and the cons, which I think was a very clever way of drawing out the dissenters. The other attraction of commitments is they grow their own legs after a while. So because of human need for certainty, you start to behave as you were taught, just like, for example, in World War II, and there's no longer a need to force people to comply because they just do it naturally after a while. And actually what happens is people seem pleased with the poor choice because at least there's certainty there. A very good phrase here is, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. And what they mean by this phrase is that consistency is generally good, so consistency is good per se, but it is foolish to stick to it rigidly. And if we have a tendency that is automatic and unthinking, consistency becomes a problem. And we have to become wary of this, because people will seek to exploit this kind of mechanical reaction in order to profit. The next area is social proof. Basically, the more social evidence we have of something working, the more we're inclined to go along with it. A good quote is from Walter Lippmann, which is that where all think alike, no one thinks very much. When there's social proof, for example, like with the vaccine, there's a lot of social proof. There's also a lot of scientific proof, by the way. I'm just using it as an example. The vaccine wouldn't work without social proof, because you need everybody to buy into it in order for it to work. Another example is when, you watch Friends, for example, and they have that stupid studio audience laughing, and in your head you're like, the joke's not funny, but everybody else is laughing, so you say to yourself, well, I must be wrong because I don't find it funny, but they find it funny, so should I find it funny? That's social proof. Other examples are like when bartenders they put money in their tip jar at the start of a night in order to encourage customers to tip. When advertisers tell us that a product is fast growing or large selling, or when nightclubs create long lines outside even though they have plenty space inside. And this is all to override the human requirement for certainty and our social inclusion needs. As I said, if you're on the fence about buying something and then that you hear that other people have bought it, you're more likely to buy it. Liking something, the friendly thief. So if you like somebody, you're more likely to do stuff for them. And the quote that the author leads with is from Clarence Darrow. The main work of a trial attorney is to make the jury like the client. So for example, we have the JFK effect. So the common example given of liking somebody was John F. Kennedy, much loved American president, and then Nixon was an example of somebody who wasn't liked, and a lot of people said that behaviours aside, because John F. Kennedy did cheat on his wife, let's not get it twisted, that it was because he was good looking, and people associate good looking people with virtue, as in, again, it's another human shortcut. We're like, a good looking person must be virtuous, can't be evil, this kind of thing. Be very wary of that. Be very wary of people who flatter you and compliment you too much, because that is a way to lower your guard. I'm sure all of you know that. We also like people who are similar to us, like look similar to us, or have things in common with us. This is called association. The same is true when good-looking models are placed beside sports car, because the advertiser hopes the product will sell because people want to be associated with attractive models. The same goes for products used by Olympic athletes. It's called the halo effect. Another effect which I have experienced myself is called the luncheon technique. When I worked for Asian people, this was definitely a way they would get around negotiating, in that you lower people's inhibitions when you feed and water them. And I know that sounds very sinister, but if you hear the phrase, let's do it over lunch, and you're talking about something serious, they're trying to reduce your boundaries. Another key example of association is football hooligans who feel like their own self is at stake when they win or lose. If you listen to football fans, they say we won, but if their team has lost, afterwards they will say they lost it for us. So there's a distance there in losing, but when it's our win, when we win, which is very, very interesting association. Now, let's get on to authority or directed deference. So there's an authority bias. We follow people who have titles before their name, doctor, professor, president, blah, blah, blah. We perceive these people as physically taller, which is fascinating. The best example of an experiment of the authority bias is by Milgram, which was the man in the white coat who told people to shock victims up to a certain voltage, and even though the people knew it was wrong, I think it was in the 60s, they continued to electrically shock. Now, it wasn't dangerous, but they didn't know that. The victims, because the man in the white coat told them to do it. This comes from the, again, shortcut, the practical advantage of the leaders telling us early on what to do. We would gain wisdom from them, and also because the leader usually controls the reward and punishment, it was in our interest to follow what they said. But the problem is that now, judges, employers, government leaders, they are not always have our best interests at heart. So you need to have this in your mind. The author gives a good example of nurses not questioning prescriptions written by doctors and pharmacists. Like the association, authority bias, for example, can be used to sell products, for example, like the George Clooney and the Nespresso, and he's like, Nespresso, what else? You're like, yeah, George, I'm sure you drink Nespresso all the time, you know what I mean? But it's that kind of, he's been like, what else would you drink? If you want to be like me, why would you drink this? So yeah. Okay, 2 more, we're nearly there. Scarcity. So supply and demand. Reduce the supply, increase the demand. This is the rule of the very few. If something seems more limited, it is more compelling. Sometimes deadlines are used buy this by next Monday. It's a psychological trigger. We don't like when something isn't in demand. We don't like when something is scarce, so it forces us to act. The same is true for censoring information or information that's blurred. We have a human tendency to want to know what's there because we feel like something's being kept from us. This is true in jury trial when a piece of evidence is inadmissible. Of course, everybody wants to know what the inadmissible evidence is, and the author argues that this is a bad idea because it's like, the toothpaste is out of the tube. We have the curiosity now, but we don't have the information, so we become reckless in our minds. And this is this experiment, and what has been found is that we will find a piece of information more persuasive if we think we can't find it, which is crazy. You might have seen this in selling houses. They'll go, oh yeah, we have 2 buyers interested, they're ready to put down money, and you're like, oh, better move. In order to counteract scarcity, you have to employ logic and realize that supply and demand are sometimes lied about. And last one is the influence around no, that's it. It was a long video, but I think it was a great video. I'm off to do some exercises now. Remember your biases. Remember forces that are at play. Always slow down, be logical, and don't be persuaded against your will. See you in the next one.